In the smoke-filled briefing rooms of the Luftwaffe, German fighter pilots laughed when intelligence reports first mentioned a new American escort fighter. Another mediocre aircraft, they assumed, just like the P-38s and P-47s that ran out of fuel halfway to the target. The Reich's aces had ruled the skies over Europe for years, their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs tearing through bomber formations with impunity. But in early 1944, something changed. American bombers began appearing over Berlin, deep in the heart of Germany, with sleek, silver fighters still circling protectively above them. The impossible had happened, and for the Luftwaffe, the laughter died in their throats as they realized they were now the hunted. Spring 1943. Over the skies of Germany, the strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany was dying. Not from lack of courage, not from insufficient bombers, but from a mathematical certainty that haunted every Allied war room from London to Washington. Fighters could not escort bombers deep into enemy territory and return home alive. General Henry Hap Arnold stood before a map of Europe in his Pentagon office, his jaw clenched as he studied the red pins marking bomber losses. Each pin represented 10 young men, sons, brothers, husbands, who would never return. The 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging crews at an unsustainable rate. In the raid on Schweinfurt in October 1943, 60 B-17 flying fortresses had been shot down in a single day. 600 men lost. The numbers were staggering, the implications catastrophic. "We're losing the air war," Arnold admitted to his staff, his voice heavy with frustration. "Without fighter escort deep into Germany, we're sending those boys to their deaths." The problem was brutally simple, yet seemingly impossible to solve. The P-47 Thunderbolt, America's primary escort fighter, was a magnificent machine, heavily armed, rugged, capable of diving like a falling anvil, but its range was limited to approximately 475 miles. The P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design, could reach slightly farther, but mechanical issues plagued it at high altitudes, and its performance in the freezing European skies was disappointing. German fighters had learned to exploit this fatal weakness with ruthless efficiency. Luftwaffe controllers tracked the American bomber streams from takeoff, calculating precisely when the escort fighters would reach their fuel limits and turn back. Then, like wolves waiting for the shepherd to leave, they struck. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s swarmed the unprotected bombers, attacking from every angle, their 20mm cannons ripping through aluminum skin and flesh with devastating effect. Major James Howard, a fighter pilot who had flown with the Flying Tigers in China before transferring to Europe, described the horror in his after-action report. "We escorted them as far as we could, maybe to the German border if we were lucky. Then we had to turn back and watch them continue alone. You'd see the contrails of German fighters gathering like vultures in the distance. We knew what was coming, and there wasn't a damn thing we could do about it." The statistics told a grim story. In 1943, the 8th Air Force's loss rate hovered around 5 to 6% per mission. This meant that a bomber crew's chances of surviving the required 25 missions were approximately 25%. 3 out of 4 would be killed, captured, or severely wounded. The psychological toll was immense. Crews watched their friends' aircraft explode or spiral down in flames, knowing their turn might come on the next mission. In Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was confident. "Let them come," he told his fighter commanders. "Our fighters will destroy them before they reach the vital targets. The Americans lack the range to protect their bombers. This is their fundamental weakness, and it will break their will to continue." German pilots shared this confidence. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, a Luftwaffe ace, wrote in his diary, "The American bombers are brave but foolish. They fly in their tight formations, believing their guns will protect them. But once their escorts turn back, they are helpless. We attack from the front, where their defensive fire is weakest, and we tear them apart. It is almost too easy. But in England, a small group of visionaries refused to accept defeat. Among them was Colonel Don Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, a hard-charging pilot who had flown Spitfires with the RAF before America entered the war. Blakesley was obsessed with the range problem. He studied fuel consumption charts, experimented with throttle settings, and pushed his maintenance crews to find every possible ounce of efficiency. "There has to be a way," Blakesley insisted to his engineering officer, Captain Claiborne Kinnard. "The Germans think they're safe because we can't reach them. But if we could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, we'd change everything." Kinnard, a methodical engineer from Virginia, shared Blakesley's frustration. "Sir, with the current fighters, it's physically impossible. The P-47 burns fuel too quickly. The P-38 has the range, but not the reliability. We'd need a completely different aircraft, something that doesn't exist yet." But it did exist. In a factory in Inglewood, California, North American Aviation had been producing a fighter that would revolutionize air warfare. The P-51 Mustang had been designed initially for the British Royal Air Force in 1940, built in just 117 days, a remarkable feat of engineering speed. But its original Allison engine limited its high-altitude performance, making it suitable primarily for ground attack and reconnaissance roles. Then came a stroke of genius that would alter the course of the war. British test pilot Ronald Harker flew a Mustang in April 1942 and immediately recognized its potential. "The airframe is brilliant," he reported to Rolls-Royce, "but it needs a better engine." The solution was the Merlin, the same supercharged engine that powered the legendary Spitfire. When Packard Motor Company began producing Merlin engines under license in America, engineers mated it to the Mustang's sleek airframe. The result was extraordinary. The P-51B, with its Packard-built Merlin V1650 engine, could fly at 440 mm at 30,000 feet, faster than almost any German fighter. But more importantly, it was astonishingly fuel-efficient. With internal fuel tanks and 2 external drop tanks, the Mustang could fly over 1,600 miles, more than enough to escort bombers to Berlin and back, a round trip of approximately 1,200 miles from English bases. In November 1943, the first P-51Bs arrived in England, assigned to the 354th Fighter Group. The pilots were skeptical. They had heard promises before about wonder weapons that would change the war. The Mustang looked elegant, almost delicate compared to the brutish P-47 with its slim fuselage and graceful lines. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard, now commanding the 354th, gathered his pilots in a cold hangar at Boxted Airfield. "Gentlemen, this aircraft is going to take us places we've never been able to go before. The range is real. The performance is real. But we need to prove it, to our bombers, to the brass, and most importantly to the Germans." The first long-range escort missions in December 1943 were tentative, almost experimental. Mustang pilots nursed their fuel, constantly checking gauges, uncertain if the promised range would materialize, but mission after mission, the numbers held. They flew deeper into Germany than any American fighter had gone before, and they returned with fuel to spare. German intelligence officers began receiving disturbing reports. American fighters were appearing over targets that should have been beyond their range. At first, Luftwaffe commanders dismissed these reports as exaggerations or misidentifications. "Impossible," declared General Major Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm. "No single engine fighter has that range. Our pilots are mistaken." But the reports persisted, growing more detailed and more alarming. On January 11, 1944, Mustangs escorted bombers to Oschersleben, deep in central Germany. On January 30th, they reached Brunswick. Each mission pushed farther, testing limits, proving capabilities. The Luftwaffe's comfortable certainty began to crack. If the Americans truly had a fighter that could escort bombers to any target in Germany, The entire defensive strategy would collapse. The Reich's industrial heartland, previously safe because of distance, would become vulnerable. The war in the air, which Germany had been winning through attrition, would shift dramatically. In Washington, General Arnold received the mission reports with barely contained excitement. "This is it," he told his staff. "This is the weapon that will win the air war. Get every Mustang we can produce to Europe. I want them escorting every bomber mission all the way to the target and back." The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the strategic bombing campaign and, ultimately, the war itself. The Germans still believed their homeland was too distant, too well defended to be truly threatened. The Americans now possessed the tool to prove them catastrophically wrong. And in the cold winter skies of early 1944, the real battle for air supremacy was about to begin. February-March 1944, the skies over Nazi Germany. The cold bit through every layer of clothing, even inside the cramped cockpit. At 25,000 feet above Germany, the temperature hovered around -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group flexed his fingers inside his leather gloves, trying to maintain feeling as he scanned the sky for enemy fighters. Below him, a massive formation of B-17 flying fortresses droned toward their target, Brunswick's aircraft factories. And for the first time in the war, American fighters were still with them, 300 miles deep into enemy territory. "Horseback leader, this is Horseback 3. Bogies, 11 o'clock high." The radio crackled with urgency. Gentile's eyes snapped to the left. There, black specks against the winter clouds, diving toward the bomber stream. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, at least 20 of them. He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the Merlin engine's smooth surge of power. "Horseback flight, drop tanks and engage." The external fuel tanks tumbled away, and the Mustangs accelerated into combat. This was the moment that would define everything. Could the P-51 not only reach these distant targets, but also fight effectively when it got there? The answer came within seconds. Gentile closed on a Bf-109, the German pilot apparently unaware of the threat behind him. The Mustang 6. 50 caliber machine guns roared, and the Messerschmitt shuddered under the impact, trailing smoke before spinning downward. Around him, other Mustangs engaged with a ferocity that shocked the Luftwaffe pilots. These weren't the lumbering P-47s they were accustomed to fighting. These silver fighters were fast, maneuverable, and they were everywhere. But the operational challenges of this new deep penetration strategy were immense and unforgiving. The Mustang's range was its greatest asset, but achieving it required meticulous planning and iron discipline. Every gallon of fuel had to be accounted for, every mile calculated with precision. Major George Preddy, who would become one of the war's top aces, described the constant mental arithmetic. "You're always doing math in your head. Fuel consumption at cruise power, fuel consumption in combat, distance to target, distance home, wind speed and direction, emergency alternates. One mistake, one miscalculation, and you're swimming in the North Sea or sitting in a German POW camp." The logistics were staggering. Each Mustang carried 269 gallons of fuel internally, plus two 108-gallon drop tanks externally, a total of 485 gallons. At optimal cruise settings, around 1,800 RPM and 26 inches of manifold pressure, the Merlin engine consumed approximately 65 gallons per hour. This gave a theoretical endurance of about 7.5 hours, but combat flying was never theoretical. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, operations officer for the 352nd Fighter Group, worked 18-hour days planning missions. "Every flight plan is a gamble," he explained to his pilots during briefings. "We calculate headwinds, tailwinds, alternate routes if the weather closes in. We plan for combat. Figure you'll burn 150 gallons in 15 minutes of hard fighting. We add reserves for emergencies. And even then, guys are landing with their fuel gauges reading empty." The weather over northern Europe in early 1944 was brutal and unpredictable. Thick cloud layers obscured landmarks, making navigation treacherous. Icing conditions could form on wings and canopies within minutes, reducing visibility and adding dangerous weight. Pilots flew for hours in instrument conditions, trusting their compasses and dead reckoning, knowing that a navigation error could be fatal. On February 20th, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Big Week, a coordinated series of massive raids against German aircraft production facilities. This was the supreme test of the Mustang's capabilities. Over 6 days, American bombers would strike targets across Germany, and the P-51s would escort them every mile of the way. The first day's target was Leipzig, 500 miles from English bases. Captain Clarence "Bud" Anderson, flying with the 357th Fighter Group, remembered the tension. "We took off in terrible weather, solid clouds from 1,000 feet to 20,000 feet. We climbed through on instruments, broke out on top, and formed up. Then we headed east, into Germany, farther than any of us had ever gone. The bomber stream stretched for miles. Over 1,000 heavy bombers protected by nearly 700 fighters, including 94 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe responded with everything they had. Over 400 German fighters rose to intercept, determined to break the American formations before they reached Leipzig. The battle that erupted was the largest air combat of the war to that point. Contrails crisscrossed the sky like chalk marks on a blue slate. Aircraft tumbled from the formations, trailing fire and smoke. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers against the winter landscape below. But the Mustangs were there at the critical moment when previously the bombers would have been alone. Lieutenant Urban Ben Drew of the 361st Fighter Group found himself in a swirling dogfight with 3 FW-190s. The Mustang could outturn them, outclimb them, and outrun them, he reported later. "I got on one's tail and stayed there. He tried everything, rolls, split S, tight turns, but I matched him move for move. When I fired, he went down." The German pilots were experiencing something new and deeply unsettling. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, the confident ace who had earlier dismissed American fighters, wrote in his diary after encountering Mustangs for the first time, "These are not the same aircraft we have been fighting. They are faster than our 109s at altitude, more maneuverable than we expected, and they have the range to be everywhere. We can no longer predict where we will be safe from escort fighters. This changes everything." But the Mustang was not invincible, and the learning curve was steep and bloody. The aircraft had teething problems that killed pilots. Early P-51Bs suffered from gun jamming at high altitude. The 50 caliber machine guns would freeze or fail to feed properly during violent maneuvers. Pilots found themselves in combat with only 2 or 3 guns working, or sometimes none at all. Captain Don Blakesley, now commanding the 4th Fighter Group, was furious when he learned of the gun problems. He confronted the engineering officers at the 8th Fighter Command headquarters. "My pilots are dying because their guns won't fire. Fix it, or I'll ground every Mustang in my group." The solution involved heating elements for the gun bays and modifications to the ammunition feed systems, but implementing these fixes took weeks. In the meantime, pilots learned to fire short bursts to prevent overheating and jamming, and to test their guns before entering combat. Another critical issue was the Mustang's fuel system. The main fuel tank was located directly behind the pilot, and when full, it affected the aircraft's center of gravity, making it unstable and difficult to maneuver. Pilots had to burn fuel from the rear tank first before engaging in combat, or risk being unable to outturn German fighters. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard learned this lesson during a mission on January 11, 1944, when he single-handedly defended a bomber formation against over 30 German fighters for more than 30 minutes. His Mustang's rear tank was still partially full, making the aircraft sluggish. "I had to use every trick I knew," he recalled. "I couldn't outturn them cleanly, so I used vertical maneuvers, zoom climbs, and diving attacks, where the Mustang's speed gave me an advantage." Howard's extraordinary courage earned him the Medal of Honor, but he emphasized the importance of proper fuel management to every pilot who would listen. The maintenance crews worked miracles to keep the Mustangs flying. Sergeant Mike "Mick" Gladich, a crew chief with the 4th Fighter Group, described the conditions. "We worked outside in freezing rain, snow, mud up to our ankles. The Merlin engine was temperamental. Spark plugs fouled, coolant systems leaked, superchargers needed constant adjustment. We'd work all night to get 12 planes ready for a dawn mission, and sometimes only 8 would make it off the ground." Yet despite the challenges, the Mustang's reliability proved superior to earlier fighters. The P-38's Allison engines were notorious for failures, and the P-47's massive radial engine, while rugged, consumed fuel at an alarming rate. The Mustang's Merlin, when properly maintained, could run for hours at high power settings without overheating or failing. By the end of Big Week, the results were undeniable. The 8th Air Force had dropped over 10,000 tons of bombs on German aircraft factories. More importantly, the Luftwaffe had lost 355 fighters destroyed and 100 damaged. Losses they could not sustain. American losses were significant: 137 bombers and 28 fighters, but the ratio had shifted dramatically in favor of the Allies. General Jimmy Doolittle, who had taken command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, made a crucial strategic decision. He changed the primary mission of the escort fighters from "stay close to the bombers" to "destroy the Luftwaffe wherever you find it." This unleashed the Mustangs to hunt aggressively, to pursue German fighters to their airfields, to strafe them on the ground during takeoff and landing. "We're not just defending anymore," Doolittle told his fighter commanders. "We're going on the offensive. I want you to seek out the enemy and destroy him. Clear the skies." The Mustang pilots embraced this new doctrine with enthusiasm. They began flying ahead of the bomber streams, clearing the route of German fighters before the bombers arrived. They stayed behind after the bombers turned for home, catching German fighters as they landed, low on fuel and vulnerable. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was devastating. German pilots could no longer assume they were safe anywhere. Not over their own airfields, not at high altitude, not even when the American bombers had passed. The silver Mustangs seemed to be everywhere, appearing suddenly out of the sun, attacking with deadly precision. General Major Adolf Galland, watching his fighter force being systematically destroyed, pleaded with Goering for reinforcements, for better aircraft, for a change in strategy. But the Reich's resources were stretched thin on multiple fronts, and the industrial capacity to replace losses was being systematically destroyed by the very bombers the Mustangs were protecting. As March 1944 arrived, the stage was set for the ultimate test. Berlin itself, the heart of Nazi Germany, 600 miles from English bases. If the Mustangs could escort bombers there and back, it would prove that no target in the Reich was beyond reach. The Germans knew it was coming. The question was whether they could stop it. March 1944. Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich. In the underground command bunker beneath Berlin's Bendler block, General Major Adolf Galland stood before a massive wall map of Germany, his face illuminated by the harsh electric lights. Red markers indicated Luftwaffe fighter bases, blue markers showed flak concentrations, and black lines traced the routes of previous American bomber raids. None of those black lines reached Berlin. "They cannot reach us here," Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering had declared repeatedly to Hitler. "Berlin is beyond the range of American fighters. Our capital is safe." This belief was not mere propaganda. It was rooted in mathematical certainty and years of operational experience. Berlin lay approximately 600 miles from American bases in England. No single-engine fighter had ever demonstrated the capability to fly 200 miles round-trip while maintaining combat effectiveness. The laws of physics, fuel capacity, and engine endurance made it impossible, or so they believed. Galland, however, was not complacent. Unlike Goering, who dismissed intelligence reports that contradicted his worldview, Galland read every after-action report from his pilots with meticulous attention, and what he read deeply troubled him. "Herr General Major, another report from Jagdgeschwader 26, his aide announced, handing him a folder. They engaged American fighters over Hanover yesterday, 300 kilometers inside the Reich. The pilots identify them as the new type, the ones they call Silver Ghosts." Galland opened the report and read the account from Hauptmann Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, a veteran ace with over 100 victories. "These American fighters are unlike anything we have faced. They appear at altitudes where we expect to have superiority. They are faster than our Bf 109G6 above 7,000 meters. They can outturn our Fu-190s in sustained combat. Most disturbing, they are appearing deeper inside Germany with each mission. If these aircraft can reach Hanover with fuel to fight, then nowhere is safe, not even Berlin." Galland circled the last sentence with a red pencil. He had been making similar calculations for weeks, and the conclusion was inescapable. If the Americans had truly solved the range problem, Berlin would be next. It was not a question of if, but when. He picked up the telephone and called Oberst Hannes Trautloft, commander of Jagddivision 1, responsible for defending northern Germany. "Hannes, I need you to prepare for the possibility of American bombers attacking Berlin with full fighter escort." There was a long pause on the other end. "Adolf, that's impossible. No fighter can—" "I know what the textbooks say," Galland interrupted. "But our pilots are reporting American fighters 500 kilometers inside the Reich, and they still have fuel to fight aggressively. We must assume Berlin is now within their range." Trautloft's voice became grim. "If they can escort bombers to Berlin, we will need every fighter we can muster. The psychological impact alone, American bombs falling on the capital while the Führer watches, it would be catastrophic for morale. And indeed, Berlin held symbolic importance far beyond its military or industrial value. It was the seat of Nazi power, the city where Hitler delivered his speeches, where the ministries of the Reich conducted their business. For 3 years, Göring had promised the German people that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. British RAF bombers had conducted night raids, but the Americans had never attempted a daylight attack. The city's population of 4 million had been assured they were safe from the terror of American precision bombing. That assurance was about to be shattered. On March 3, 1944, at Debden Airfield in England, Colonel Don Blakesley gathered his pilots from the 4th Fighter Group in the briefing room. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Rumors had been circulating for days that a major mission was coming, something unprecedented. When the curtain was pulled back from the wall map, revealing the red ribbon stretching from England across the North Sea, across Holland, across northern Germany, all the way to Berlin, the room erupted in excited chatter. "Gentlemen, quiet down," Blakesley commanded. His voice was calm, but his eyes gleamed with fierce determination. "Today, we're going to Berlin. We're going to escort the bombers all the way to the target and all the way home. The Germans think it's impossible. We're going to prove them wrong." Captain Don Gentile, sitting in the front row, felt his pulse quicken. Berlin, the Big B. Every pilot in the 8th Air Force had dreamed of this moment, striking at the heart of Nazi Germany, showing the enemy that nowhere was beyond reach. But the mission planning revealed just how audacious this operation truly was. The round trip would be approximately 1,100 miles, pushing the Mustang to its absolute maximum range. Weather forecasts showed variable conditions, with possible headwinds on the return leg. Any combat would consume precious fuel. There would be no margin for error. Major James Goodson, operations officer for the 4th Fighter Group, outlined the fuel management plan. "You'll take off with full internal tanks and 2 108-gallon drop tanks. Cruise at 1 to 800 RPM, 26 inches manifold pressure. That gives you maximum range. You'll drop the external tanks when you cross into Germany or when you engage the enemy, whichever comes first. Once you're on internal fuel, you have approximately 2 hours before you must turn for home, combat or no combat. The implications were clear. If a pilot got separated from the formation, if he had to engage in extended combat, if he encountered headwinds stronger than forecast, he might not make it home. The North Sea was cold and unforgiving. Survival time in the water was measured in minutes. Lieutenant Willard Milliken raised his hand. "Sir, what if we encounter heavy opposition over the target? What if we have to fight our way in and fight our way out?" Blakesley's answer was blunt. "Then some of us won't make it back, but the bombers will get through. That's the mission." At 10:30 hours on March 4, 1944, the first Mustangs began taking off from airfields across eastern England. The roar of Merlin engines shattered the morning calm as over 170 P-51s climbed into the overcast sky. Behind them, more than 500 B-17 and B-24 bombers were forming up, their crews knowing that for the first time they would have fighter protection all the way to Berlin. In the Mustang cockpits, pilots settled into the routine of long-distance flight, constant scanning of instruments, monitoring fuel consumption, checking oxygen flow, flexing fingers and toes to maintain circulation in the bitter cold. The formation crossed the English coast at Lowestoft, then headed out over the grey North Sea. In Berlin, the air raid sirens began wailing at 11:45 hours. The population had heard these sirens before during RAF night raids, but a daylight attack was different, more frightening because you could see the bombers coming, could watch the bombs falling, could witness the destruction in terrible clarity. Galland was in the operations room when the reports began flooding in. Large formation of American bombers crossing the Dutch border, heading southeast, estimated 500 heavy bombers. Fighter escort observed, type unknown, but believed to be the new American fighters. He immediately ordered every available fighter into the air. Jagdgeschwader 1, 3, 11, 26, 27, 54. Over 350 German fighters scrambled from airfields across northern Germany. If the Americans were truly coming to Berlin, they would face the most concentrated fighter defense of the war. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, now flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, climbed through the clouds in his Bf 109G6. His squadron had been ordered to intercept the bombers before they reached Berlin. As he broke through the cloud layer at 7,000 meters, he saw them, a sight that made his blood run cold. The sky was filled with American aircraft. Hundreds of bombers in tight combat boxes, their contrails creating a white lattice against the blue sky. And surrounding them, above them, below them, silver fighters, dozens of them, the Mustangs. "Achtung! Enemy fighters, high and level!" his wingman called out. Knoke looked up and saw a flight of 4 Mustangs diving toward his formation. He broke hard left, pulling his Messerschmitt into a tight turn. The lead Mustang followed, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Knoke pushed his aircraft to its limits, the G-forces pressing him into his seat, his vision narrowing to a tunnel. But the Mustang stayed with him. Knoke tried every maneuver he knew, barrel rolls, split S, climbing turns, but the American pilot matched him, move for move. Tracer rounds streaked past his canopy. He felt impacts, the Mustang's .50 caliber bullets punching through his aircraft's thin aluminum skin. Smoke began pouring from his engine. The Messerschmitt shuddered and began losing altitude. Knoke had no choice. He pulled the canopy release and bailed out, his parachute deploying as his fighter spiraled down toward the forests below. As he descended, hanging beneath his parachute, Knoke watched the battle raging above. German fighters were being shot down everywhere he looked. The Mustangs were not just defending the bombers, they were hunting, attacking with an aggression the Luftwaffe had not anticipated, and through it all, the bomber stream continued inexorably toward Berlin. At 12:15 hours, the first American bombs fell on Berlin. The targets were ball-bearing plants and railway yards in the southern districts, but the psychological impact was far greater than the physical damage. American bombers were over Berlin in broad daylight, and the vaunted Luftwaffe had been unable to stop them. In his command bunker, Galland listened to the reports with a sinking feeling. His fighters had engaged the Americans with everything they had, but the Mustangs had been there at every critical moment. The bomber formations had been disrupted, but not broken. And now those silver fighters were escorting the bombers back out of German airspace, still fighting, still protecting their charges. The final tally was devastating for the Luftwaffe. 69 German fighters destroyed, with dozens more damaged. The Americans lost 16 bombers and 3 fighters, a ratio that was unsustainable for Germany, but acceptable for the Americans. But the numbers told only part of the story. The real impact was psychological and strategic. The myth of Berlin's invulnerability had been shattered. The Luftwaffe's defensive strategy, based on the assumption that distance would protect the Reich's heartland, had been rendered obsolete in a single day. That evening, Göring was summoned to Hitler's presence. The Führer was in a rage. "You promised me Berlin was safe. You promised me no American bomber would reach the capital, and today they bombed us in daylight while the entire city watched." Göring, for once, had no bluster, no excuses. "Mein Führer, the Americans have a new fighter. It has capabilities we did not anticipate. It can escort their bombers anywhere in Germany." Hitler's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Then destroy it. Destroy every one of those fighters. I don't care how many of our aircraft it takes. The Americans must not be allowed to bomb Berlin with impunity." But Galland knew the truth that Göring could not admit to Hitler. The Americans had not just built a better fighter, they had fundamentally changed the equation of air warfare. The Mustang had turned the hunter into the hunted, and there was no easy solution, no wonder weapon that could restore German air superiority. As night fell over Berlin, the city's population emerged from shelters to survey the damage. The physical destruction was relatively limited, a few factories damaged, some residential buildings destroyed. But the psychological wound was deep. If the Americans could bomb Berlin once, they could do it again, and again, until there was nothing left. In England, the Mustang pilots were celebrating. They had done the impossible. They had taken the war to Hitler's doorstep and returned home. Don Gentile, who had shot down 3 German fighters over Berlin, raised a glass in the officers' club. "To the Mustang," he toasted, "the fighter that changed everything." But the war was far from over. The Luftwaffe would adapt, would fight back with desperate ferocity. The coming months would test the Mustang and its pilots in ways they could not yet imagine. April-May 1944. The skies over Germany. The success of the Berlin raid had unleashed a strategic nightmare for the Luftwaffe. Within days, American bombers returned to the German capital, this time with even larger fighter escorts. On March 6th, they came again. On March 8th, again. Each raid drove deeper into the Reich's psychological armor. Each mission proved that the Mustang's range was not a fluke, but a permanent, devastating reality. In the operations room at Luftwaffe High Command, General Major Adolf Galland faced a crisis that threatened to destroy his fighter force entirely. The statistics were brutal and undeniable. In March 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost 492 fighter pilots killed or missing, an attrition rate of nearly 20% per month. At this pace, the entire fighter arm would be decimated within 6 months. "We are losing experienced pilots faster than we can train replacements," Galland reported to Göring during a tense meeting on April 2nd. "The Americans have numerical superiority, technical superiority with their new fighter, and now they have tactical superiority. Our pilots are exhausted, flying 3 or 4 missions per day, and they know they are facing an enemy they cannot defeat." Göring's face reddened with anger. "Are you telling me that German pilots are inferior to Americans? That our fighters cannot match theirs?" "I am telling you the truth," Galland replied, his voice steady despite the danger of contradicting his superior. "The P-51 Mustang is faster than our Bf-109 above 7,000 meters, more maneuverable than our FW-190 in sustained combat, and it has twice the range of any fighter we possess. Our pilots are brave, but bravery alone cannot overcome such disadvantages. The Luftwaffe's response was born of desperation. If they could not match the Mustang's performance, they would try to overwhelm it with numbers and new tactics. Galland ordered the formation of Sturmgruppen, heavily armored FW-190s equipped with additional armor plating and 30mm cannons, designed to attack bomber formations head-on while lighter fighters engaged the escorts. Oberst Walter Dahl, commander of Jagdgeschwader 300, volunteered to lead the first Sturmgruppe assault. "We will accept losses," he told his pilots during briefing. "Our mission is to break the bomber formations, even if it costs us our lives. The heavily armored FW-190s can withstand defensive fire from the bombers. We will press our attacks to point-blank range, 50 meters or less. One burst from our 30mm cannons will destroy a bomber." The tactic was suicidal in its conception, but it reflected the Luftwaffe's growing desperation. On April 11, 1944, Dahl led 60 Sturmgruppe fighters in a massed assault against a bomber formation heading to Oschersleben. The German fighters formed a tight wedge and drove straight into the bomber stream, their armor absorbing the defensive fire. For a few terrible minutes, the tactic worked. 8 B-17s were shot down in rapid succession, their formations disrupted by the ferocity of the assault. But then, the Mustangs arrived. Captain Don Gentile, leading a flight of 4 P-51s from the 4th Fighter Group, saw the German formation and immediately recognized the threat. "Horseback flight, those are the heavy fighters. They're going after the bombers. Break them up." The Mustangs dove into the German formation from above, their 6 50-caliber machine guns blazing. The heavily armored FW-190s, designed to withstand fire from bomber defensive guns, were vulnerable to attack from behind and above. Gentile's first burst caught a Focke-Wulf in the engine, and it exploded in a ball of fire. His wingman, Lieutenant John Godfrey, destroyed another. The German formation disintegrated under the assault. The Sturmgruppe fighters, slow and heavy with their additional armor, could not maneuver effectively against the nimble Mustangs. Within minutes, 23 German fighters had been shot down. Dahl himself barely escaped, his aircraft riddled with bullet holes. That evening, Dahl reported to Galland with barely contained fury. "The tactic works against the bombers, but the American fighters are always there. They are above us, behind us, everywhere. We cannot execute our attacks without being slaughtered by those damned Mustangs." The crisis deepened in May when the Americans introduced a new variant, the P-51D. This version featured a bubble canopy that provided 360-degree visibility, eliminating the blind spot behind the pilot that had plagued earlier models. It also had 6 50-caliber guns with improved reliability, solving the jamming problems that had frustrated pilots in combat. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, now commanding the 352nd Fighter Group, flew one of the first P-51Ds in combat. "The bubble canopy changed everything," he recalled. "You could see behind you without craning your neck. You could spot enemy fighters before they got into firing position. It was like having eyes in the back of your head." But the Mustang's greatest advantage was not just its technical superiority. It was the quality and training of its pilots. By spring 1944, American fighter pilots were receiving extensive training before being sent to combat. They logged 400 hours of flight time, including advanced gunnery, formation flying, and combat tactics. They arrived in England with the skills and confidence to face veteran German pilots on equal terms. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was forced to send pilots into combat with as little as 150 hours of training. Fuel shortages meant that advanced training was curtailed. New pilots arrived at frontline squadrons, barely able to fly their aircraft, let alone fight in them. Lieutenant Heinz Röcker, a 19-year-old pilot assigned to Jagdgeschwader 27 in May 1944, described his first combat mission. "I had never fired my guns in combat. I had never flown in formation at high altitude. My first mission was to intercept American bombers over Brunswick. I saw the Mustangs diving on us, and I froze. My squadron leader was shot down in the first pass. I broke formation and ran for the clouds. I was terrified. Rooker survived that mission, but many of his comrades did not. The Luftwaffe was losing not just aircraft, but irreplaceable experienced pilots. The aces who had fought since 1939, who knew every trick of aerial combat, who could train the next generation. When these men died, their knowledge died with them. Major Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace in history with 352 victories, most of them on the Eastern Front, was transferred to the West in May 1944 to assess the situation. What he found shocked him. The pilots in the West are fighting a different war than we fight in the East, he reported. Against the Soviets we have qualitative superiority. Against the Americans we are outmatched in every category: aircraft performance, pilot training, numbers, and most critically, fuel. The Americans can afford to fly training missions, practice missions, sweep missions. We can barely afford to intercept their bombers. The fuel crisis was becoming catastrophic. Germany's synthetic fuel plants were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. By May 1944, aviation fuel production had dropped by 30%. Galland was forced to make impossible choices: allocate fuel for training or for combat operations. Every gallon used in training was a gallon not available for defending the Reich. The Mustang pilots, meanwhile, were growing in confidence and aggression. They no longer simply escorted bombers. They hunted German fighters wherever they could be found. They strafed airfields, catching German aircraft during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. They flew low-level missions, shooting up trains, trucks, and fuel depots. Captain Clarence "Bud" Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group described the new aggressive tactics. We'd escort the bombers to the target, make sure they were safe, then we'd drop down to the deck and look for targets of opportunity. Airfields were prime targets. We'd catch them landing, low on fuel, unable to maneuver. It was dangerous. The flak was intense, but it was effective. We were destroying German fighters faster than they could replace them. On May 8, 1944, Anderson led a strafing attack on an airfield near Leipzig. His flight of 4 Mustangs swept in at treetop level, catching a dozen Bf-109s in the landing pattern. Anderson destroyed 3 aircraft on the ground and damaged 2 more in the air. But his wingman, Lieutenant Richard Peterson, was hit by flak and crashed. Anderson circled the wreckage, hoping to see a parachute, but there was none. Peterson had been killed instantly. The loss hit Anderson hard. "Every mission, we lost someone," he wrote in his diary that night. "Good men, friends, pilots I'd trained with. The Germans were losing more, but that didn't make it easier. War is about killing and being killed and somehow finding the strength to go up again the next day." Until the psychological toll on both sides was immense. German pilots knew they were fighting a losing battle. Every morning they looked at the empty beds in their barracks, the missing faces in the mess hall. They flew, knowing that statistically they would not survive the month. Some became fatalistic, flying with reckless abandon. Others became cautious, avoiding combat when possible, trying to survive just one more day. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, who had bailed out over Berlin in March, returned to combat in May. But he was a changed man. "I no longer believe we can win," he confided to his diary. "The Americans have too many fighters, too many bombers, too much of everything. We shoot down 10 and 20 more appear. We are drowning in a sea of silver Mustangs." The Americans, too, felt the strain. Despite their advantages, combat was still deadly and unpredictable. A moment's inattention, a mechanical failure, a lucky shot from a German pilot, any of these could be fatal. The Mustang pilots flew mission after mission, watching their friends die, knowing their own turn might come at any moment. Major George Preddy, the top Mustang ace with 26 victories by June 1944, described the emotional exhaustion. "You can't think about it too much. You can't dwell on the losses, or you'll go crazy. You focus on the mission, on your wingman, on getting home. You celebrate the victories, mourn the losses, and then you do it all again tomorrow. By the end of May 1944, the strategic situation was clear. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Germany. The Mustang had proven to be the decisive weapon in the air war, enabling the strategic bombing campaign to continue with devastating effectiveness. German aircraft production was being systematically destroyed. Fuel supplies were dwindling. Pilot losses were unsustainable. But the Luftwaffe was not defeated. Not yet. Galland was planning a desperate counterstroke, a massed assault that would throw every available fighter against a single American raid, hoping to inflict such catastrophic losses that the Americans would be forced to reconsider their strategy. The stage was set for the climactic battles of summer 1944, when the Luftwaffe would make its final desperate attempt to regain control of the skies over Germany. The Mustang had brought the Americans to the brink of victory, but the war was not over. The bloodiest fighting was still to come. June-August 1944, the collapse of the Luftwaffe. The morning of June 6, 1944, changed everything. As Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Luftwaffe faced a strategic catastrophe on two fronts. While American and British bombers continued their relentless assault on German industry from the air, ground forces now threatened to liberate Western Europe. The fighter force that Galland had struggled to preserve was suddenly needed everywhere at once, and sufficient nowhere. In the skies over Normandy, the Luftwaffe's absence was conspicuous and humiliating. On D-Day itself, the German Air Force managed only 319 sorties against over 14,000 Allied sorties. Luftwaffe pilots who did venture over the invasion beaches found themselves hopelessly outnumbered, swarmed by Mustangs, Spitfires and Thunderbolts. The silver P-51s were not just escorting bombers anymore. They were providing air cover for the largest amphibious invasion in history. General Major Adolf Galland stood in his office at Luftwaffe High Command, staring at a map that showed the impossible situation. Red markers indicated where fighters were desperately needed: over Normandy, over the Reich's industrial centers, over the oil refineries that were being systematically destroyed. Blue markers showed where his fighters actually were: scattered, depleted, running out of fuel and ammunition. "We have 425 operational fighters in the West," his operations officer reported. "The Americans and British have over 5,000. The ratio is 12-1 against us." Galland's jaw tightened. "And fuel. Enough for perhaps 2 weeks of intensive operations. After that," the officer's voice trailed off. They both knew what came after that, but Galland was not ready to surrender. He had been developing a plan, a desperate all-or-nothing gamble that might inflict such devastating losses on the Americans that they would be forced to pause their bombing campaign. He called it Der große Schlag, the great blow. The concept was simple but audacious. Concentrate every available fighter in Germany, perhaps 1,000 aircraft, and throw them against a single American bomber raid. Overwhelm the escorts through sheer numbers, break through to the bombers, and destroy 200 or 300 of them in a single day. The psychological and material impact would be catastrophic for the Americans. On June 20th, 1944, Galland presented the plan to Göring. "We cannot win a war of attrition," he argued. "The Americans produce more aircraft in a month than we produce in a year. But if we can inflict a single devastating blow, if we can show them that the cost of bombing Germany is unbearable, we might force them to negotiate." Göring, desperate for any solution that might appease Hitler, approved the plan. Orders went out to every fighter unit in Germany: conserve fuel, prepare for a maximum effort, wait for the signal. But the plan had a fatal flaw. It required time to concentrate forces, and time was the one thing the Luftwaffe no longer had. Every day, American bombers struck at oil refineries, aircraft factories, and transportation networks. Every day, the Mustangs hunted German fighters, destroying them in the air and on the ground. The great blow kept being postponed, waiting for the perfect moment that never came. Meanwhile, the Mustang pilots were writing the final chapter of the air war over Germany. The summer of 1944 saw some of the most intense aerial combat of the entire war, and the P-51 dominated every engagement. On July 7, 1944, Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group achieved one of the most remarkable feats in aerial combat history. Leading his flight on an escort mission to Leipzig, Preddy encountered a formation of 30 Bf-109s preparing to attack the bombers. In the span of just 8 minutes, Preddy shot down 6 German fighters, a display of marksmanship and tactical brilliance that left his wingmen in awe. "I've never seen anything like it," Lieutenant William Wisner recalled. George would close to 200 yards, fire a short burst, and the German fighter would explode or spin down trailing smoke. Then he'd immediately acquire another target. His gunnery was perfect, his deflection shooting was instinctive. The Germans didn't have a chance. But Preddy's success came at a cost. His closest friend, Captain William Wisner, was shot down 2 days later during a strafing attack on an airfield near Munich. Wisner survived and evaded capture, eventually making it back to Allied lines. But the incident reminded everyone that even the best pilots were never safe. The Luftwaffe's pilot quality continued to deteriorate catastrophically. By July 1944, the average German fighter pilot had less than 100 hours of flight time before entering combat. They were being thrown into battle against American pilots who had 400 hours of training and months of combat experience. Lieutenant Franz Stiegler, a veteran pilot with Jagdgeschwader 27, described the situation in his diary. "The new pilots arrive, and they are dead within a week. They do not know how to fly in formation, how to watch their tails, how to conserve ammunition. They see the Mustangs and they panic. I have stopped learning their names. It is easier that way." On August 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe attempted a coordinated assault that came closest to Gallen's vision of the Great Blow. Over 300 German fighters were concentrated to intercept a raid on Berlin. The battle that ensued was one of the largest air combats of the war and one of the most one-sided. Captain Clarence "Bud" Anderson was leading the 357th Fighter Group that day. "We saw them coming from miles away," he recalled, "a huge gaggle of German fighters climbing to intercept the bombers. We had altitude advantage and we dove on them. It was a massacre." The Mustangs tore through the German formation with devastating efficiency. The inexperienced German pilots broke formation immediately, each man fighting for his own survival. The veterans tried to maintain cohesion, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of American fighters. Within 30 minutes, 63 German fighters had been shot down. The Americans lost 4. Among the German casualties was Oberleutnant Heinz Knocke, the ace who had witnessed the first Mustang raids on Berlin. His Bf-109 was hit by a burst from Captain John England's P-51. Knocke bailed out for the second time, landing in a field near Brandenburg. As he gathered his parachute, he looked up at the sky and saw the contrails of the American bombers continuing toward Berlin, the silver Mustangs still circling protectively above them. "We have lost," he said aloud to no one. "The war is over, even if the fighting continues." The systematic destruction of Germany's oil production sealed the Luftwaffe's fate. By August 1944, aviation fuel production had dropped to just 30% of what it had been in March. Galland was forced to ground entire fighter wings simply because there was no fuel to fly them. Training was virtually eliminated. Every drop of fuel had to be reserved for combat operations. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. German fighters sat on airfields, unable to take off, while American bombers flew overhead unopposed. When fighters did manage to scramble, they often had fuel for only a single pass at the bombers before having to land. The Mustangs, with their superior range, could loiter over German airfields, waiting for fighters to land, then strafe them when they were most vulnerable. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer described the surreal experience of flying over Germany in August 1944. We'd fly for an hour deep into Germany and see no enemy fighters at all. The sky was empty except for our bombers and escorts. Occasionally we'd see a lone German fighter climbing toward us, and we'd go down and engage. It was almost sad. One German against 4 or 6 Mustangs. They didn't have a chance, but they kept trying. The psychological impact on German civilians was profound. For years, they had been told that the Luftwaffe was invincible, that German fighters would protect them from enemy bombers. Now they watched helplessly as American bombers flew over their cities in broad daylight, dropping thousands of tons of bombs, while German fighters were nowhere to be seen. In Berlin, Galland made one final attempt to salvage the situation. He proposed withdrawing all fighters from the Western Front, abandoning any attempt to contest Allied air superiority over France, and concentrating everything on defending the Reich's industrial heartland. It was an admission of defeat, but it might buy time. Goering rejected the proposal. "The Führer will never accept such a defeatist strategy," he declared. "We will continue to fight on all fronts." Galland knew it was over. On August 20th, 1944, he submitted a report to Hitler that laid out the brutal truth. "The Luftwaffe has lost air superiority over Germany. Our fighter force is being destroyed faster than it can be replaced. Pilot losses are unsustainable. Fuel shortages make effective operations impossible. The American P-51 Mustang has proven to be a decisive weapon that has fundamentally altered the balance of air power. Without immediate and drastic measures, the Luftwaffe will cease to exist as an effective fighting force within 3 months." Hitler read the report and flew into a rage. He accused Galland of defeatism, of cowardice, of betraying the Reich, but he could not deny the reality. The skies over Germany belonged to the Americans, and the silver Mustangs were the symbol of that dominance. By the end of August 1944, the statistics told the story of complete defeat. Since January, the Luftwaffe had lost over 2,200 fighter pilots killed or missing, an entire generation of aviators destroyed. Aircraft production, despite Herculean efforts by Albert Speer's ministry, could not keep pace with losses. And most critically, the fuel to fly the aircraft that did exist was simply not available. The Mustang had achieved what no other weapon system had accomplished. It had broken the Luftwaffe's back. The strategic bombing campaign, which had been on the verge of failure in 1943, was now succeeding beyond the most optimistic predictions. German industry was being systematically destroyed. Transportation networks were paralyzed, and civilian morale was collapsing. But the human cost had been enormous on both sides. The 8th Air Force had lost over 4,000 aircraft and 40,000 aircrew since the beginning of the campaign. Every mission meant young men dying in burning aircraft, parachuting into captivity, or disappearing forever into the cold waters of the North Sea. Major George Preddy, the top Mustang ace, reflected on the cost during a quiet moment in August. "We're winning. Everyone can see that now. But I look around the squadron and see all the empty chairs, all the friends who didn't make it. Was it worth it? I don't know. I just know we had a job to do, and we did it. The Mustang gave us the tool we needed. The rest was up to us." As summer turned to autumn, the war entered its final phase. The Luftwaffe still existed, still fought, but it was a shadow of its former self, a broken force struggling to delay the inevitable. The Mustang had proven to be the decisive weapon in the air war, the fighter that changed everything. And in the skies over Germany, the Silver Ghosts continued their relentless patrol, symbols of American air supremacy and harbingers of the Reich's final defeat. September 1944, May 1945 and beyond. The autumn mists rolled across the airfield at Debden, England, as Colonel Don Blakesley walked among the rows of P-51 Mustangs, their silver fuselages gleaming in the pale morning light. It was September 15th, 1944, and Blakesley was preparing for what would be one of his final combat missions. He paused beside his personal aircraft, touched the worn metal of the fuselage, and reflected on how completely the war had changed since those desperate days of 1943. "We've won the air war," he said to his crew chief, Sergeant Merle Olmsted. "The Germans know it. We know it. Now it's just a matter of time." Olmsted nodded, wiping oil from his hands. "Yes, sir. But they're still fighting. Still dangerous." Indeed, the Luftwaffe was not yet finished. In the final months of 1944, German engineers introduced the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. With a top speed of 540 mph, it was nearly 100 mph faster than the Mustang. In the hands of experienced pilots, the Me-262 was a devastating weapon capable of slashing through bomber formations before escorts could react. On October 7, 1944, Lieutenant Urban Ben Drew of the 361st Fighter Group encountered Me-262s for the first time during an escort mission to Berlin. "I saw two of them diving on the bomber formation," he recalled. "They were incredibly fast, just streaks across the sky. They fired their rockets into the bombers and then accelerated away before we could intercept. I'd never seen anything move that fast." But the Me-262, for all its technological superiority, came too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome. Fuel shortages meant the jets could rarely fly. Inexperienced pilots struggled to master the aircraft's tricky handling characteristics, and the Mustang pilots developed tactics to counter the jet's speed advantage. Major George Preddy, now the leading Mustang ace with 26.83 victories, pioneered anti-jet tactics. "You can't catch them in level flight," he instructed his pilots, "but they have to slow down to land. That's when they're vulnerable. We patrol their airfields, wait for them to come in low and slow, then we bounce them." On November 2, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer executed this tactic perfectly. He spotted two Me-262s approaching their base at Acma, gear down, flaps extended for landing. Meyer dove from 10,000 feet, closing to 300 yards before opening fire. His first burst hit the lead jet's engine, and it exploded on impact with the ground. The second jet tried to accelerate away, but Meyer stayed with it, firing continuously until it, too, crashed in flames. The Luftwaffe's final months were characterized by desperation and futility. Galland, who had been relieved of his command in January 1945 after repeated clashes with Göring, formed Jagdverband 44, an elite unit flying Me-262s and staffed entirely by veteran aces. It was a last gesture of defiance, a symbol of what might have been if the jets had arrived 2 years earlier. But symbols could not change reality. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Fuel production had ceased entirely. Aircraft sat abandoned on airfields. Pilots who had survived years of combat were being transferred to infantry units to fight the advancing Allied armies on the ground. The final statistics of the air war were staggering. From January 1944 to May 1945, the 8th Air Force flew over 300,000 bomber sorties and dropped 700,000 tons of bombs on Germany. The P-51 Mustang flew over 213,000 sorties, destroyed 4,150 enemy aircraft in the air and another 4,131 on the ground. The cost was significant, 2,120 Mustangs lost in combat, but the impact was decisive. Major George Preddy did not live to see the final victory. On Christmas Day, 1944, while pursuing a German fighter at low altitude, he was hit by friendly fire from American anti-aircraft guns. He crashed near Liège, Belgium, and died instantly. He was 25 years old. His death was a bitter reminder that even in the final months of a won war, combat remained lethal and unforgiving. Captain Clarence "Bud" Anderson survived the war with 16.25 victories, completing 116 combat missions without being shot down. A testament to skill, discipline, and no small amount of luck. Years later, he reflected on the Mustang's impact. The P-51 didn't win the war by itself, but it made victory possible. It gave us the range to escort bombers anywhere in Germany. It gave us the performance to dominate German fighters, and it gave us the confidence to take the fight to the enemy, wherever he was. Without the Mustang, the strategic bombing campaign would have failed. With it, we destroyed the Luftwaffe and crippled Germany's ability to wage war. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. In the final accounting, the strategic bombing campaign had destroyed 60% of Germany's industrial capacity, paralyzed its transportation network, and diverted enormous resources to air defense that might otherwise have been used on the ground. The Mustang had been the indispensable tool that made this possible. But the legacy of the P-51 extended far beyond World War II. The aircraft had fundamentally transformed military aviation doctrine. Before the Mustang, conventional wisdom held that long-range escort was impossible, that fighters lacked the range and endurance to protect bombers deep into enemy territory. The P-51 proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. Post-war analysis by military historians and strategists identified the Mustang as one of the decisive weapons of World War II, ranking alongside the atomic bomb, radar, and the T-34 tank in its strategic impact. General Karl Spaatz, commander of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, stated in 1945, "Without the P-51, we could not have won the air war over Germany. It was the single most important fighter aircraft of the war." The technological lessons learned from the Mustang influenced fighter design for decades. The importance of range, the value of a laminar flow wing for high-speed efficiency, the effectiveness of the bubble canopy for visibility, all became standard features in post-war fighter aircraft. The North American F-86 Sabre, which dominated the skies over Korea in the 1950s, was a direct descendant of the Mustang's design philosophy. The human stories, too, became part of aviation legend. The Mustang aces, Preddy, Gentile, Godfrey, Meyer, Anderson, and dozens of others became symbols of American air power and the courage of the young men who flew into combat day after day. Their tactics, their innovations, their sacrifice became case studies in military academies around the world. For the Luftwaffe pilots who survived, the Mustang remained a symbol of their defeat. General Major Adolf Galland, who lived until 1996, wrote in his memoirs, "The P-51 Mustang was the most significant development in fighter aviation during World War II. It appeared at the critical moment when the air war hung in the balance, and it tipped that balance decisively in favor of the Allies. We had no answer to it. Our jets came too late. Our fuel ran out. Our pilots were overwhelmed. The Mustang was the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe's back." Heinz Knoke, the ace who had mocked American fighters in 1943 and been shot down twice by Mustangs, survived the war and became a commercial pilot. In his published diary, he wrote, "We underestimated the Americans. We believed our technical superiority and our combat experience would be enough. But they built a fighter that was better than ours. They trained pilots who were as good as ours, and they produced them in numbers we could never match." The Mustang was the symbol of American industrial and technological power. When we saw those silver fighters escorting bombers to Berlin, we knew the war was lost. The aircraft themselves became treasured artifacts. After the war, many P-51s were sold as surplus, converted to air races, or preserved in museums. Today, approximately 150 Mustangs remain airworthy, flying at air shows and commemorative events around the world. The distinctive sound of the Merlin engine, a deep, throaty roar, still evokes memories of the greatest air battles in history. In the decades since 1945, military strategists have studied the Mustang's development and deployment as a case study in how technology can alter the course of war. The aircraft was not a revolutionary design. It combined existing technologies, the Merlin engine, laminar flow wing, drop tanks, in an innovative way. But that combination, applied at the critical moment, changed everything. The lesson was clear. In modern warfare, technological superiority matters. The side that can innovate faster, produce better weapons, and deploy them effectively will prevail. The Mustang proved that a single weapon system, if it addresses a critical vulnerability, can have strategic impact far beyond its tactical capabilities. For the bomber crews who flew deep into Germany, the Mustang represented salvation. Thousands of young men owed their lives to the silver fighters that escorted them through the flak, and the enemy fighters that stayed with them all the way to the target and all the way home. In the reunions and commemorations that followed the war, bomber crews and fighter pilots shared a bond forged in the desperate skies over Germany, a bond based on mutual respect and shared sacrifice. As the sun set on that September evening in 1944, Colonel Blakesley climbed into his Mustang for one more mission. The engine roared to life, the propeller became a blur, and the sleek fighter rolled down the runway and lifted into the sky. Below, the ground crew watched until the aircraft disappeared into the clouds, heading east toward Germany. The war would continue for 8 more months. Men would continue to die in the cold skies over Europe. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Mustang had done its job. It had escorted the bombers to Berlin and back. It had broken the Luftwaffe. It had proven that American ingenuity, industrial power, and the courage of young pilots could overcome any obstacle. And in the history of aviation, in the annals of World War II, the P-51 Mustang would forever be remembered as the fighter that changed everything. The silver ghost that haunted the skies over Germany and wrote the final chapter of the air war in contrails across the European sky. The German pilots had mocked it. They had laughed at intelligence reports of a new American fighter. They had believed their homeland was safe, protected by distance and the laws of physics. They were wrong, and that mistake cost them the war. The story of the P-51 Mustang and the brave pilots who flew it reminds us that innovation, courage, and determination can overcome seemingly impossible odds. These young men, American, British, and German, fought in the skies over Europe with a ferocity and skill that defined a generation. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from World War II. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Did you have a relative who flew in the war? What aspect of this story surprised you most? And don't forget to like this video to help others discover these remarkable stories of courage and sacrifice. The Silver Mustangs may no longer patrol the skies over Europe, but their legacy endures, a testament to what can be achieved when necessity drives innovation, and when brave individuals rise to meet the challenges of their time. Thank you for watching. Remember history, honor those who served,